They tell the story like it was a clean win for democracy. A secret meeting gets exposed. A private banking scheme gets laughed out of Congress. The public stays vigilant. The money trust loses. End of lesson. But if that draft really failed, why does so much of it feel familiar now? Why do the same phrases keep coming back, dressed in different uniforms? Why does the system that was supposedly rejected end up looking like the system that arrived anyway? Maybe the Aldrich Plan didn't lose. Maybe it just learned to stop using its own name. In 1910, a handful of powerful men traveled south in near silence. No speeches, no public itinerary, no press. They used first names only. They avoided being seen together. Not because they were planning a crime, but because they were planning something that would look like one. The problem wasn't a lack of money in America. It was that the money kept panicking. Banks were private, fragmented, jealous of each other. They lent short and borrowed shorter. When confidence cracked, everything froze. People didn't need a lecture on monetary theory. They just needed the doors to open and the payroll to clear. The last major panic had left a clear impression. It wasn't the government that saved the system. It was a private syndicate, a small circle with a single organizer deciding who lived and who didn't. That rescue worked, which made it terrifying. If the country depended on private judgment in a crisis, then private judgment would start shaping the country. So the pressure was simple and brutal. Do nothing and accept recurring breakdowns. Or build a new machine that could pump cash into the system when fear made everyone clutch it. But there was a second pressure, quieter and sharper. Whoever built the machine would decide who held the lever. The men who met in secret weren't motivated by one single emotion. Some were genuinely alarmed by instability. Some were angry that New York kept bearing the blame for a national system that forced it into the role of fire brigade. Some were thinking about international credibility, the way European finance looked down on America as a rich country with a fragile spine. And some were thinking about power the way bankers always think about it, not as a headline, but as a valve. A central bank was not an exotic idea. Europe had them. America had once had something similar, and the memory still burned. Central banking in the United States was never just a technical design choice. It was a political insult. It sounded like aristocracy. It sounded like backroom control. It sounded like the same old fight between local autonomy and national coordination. So, if you wanted to build a central bank in America, you couldn't build a central bank in America. Not openly. Not in that language. Not with those faces on the bill. The Aldrich Plan was the first serious attempt to solve that contradiction. It tried to take the reality of financial power and formalize it, not in a cartoon villain way, in a boardroom way, in a way that looked, to its authors, like responsible modernization. It proposed a reserve institution that could expand credit when the system seized up. It would hold the reserves of member banks. It would issue currency against sound assets. It would act as a lender of last resort. It would standardize the plumbing. So every panic didn't require improvisation and personal favors. And here's the part that made it radioactive. The structure was designed to be run by the banks themselves, with leadership tied closely to the financial centers that already dominated the country. It wasn't secret ownership of government. It was something more subtle, the conversion of private influence into permanent governance. To the people who wrote it, that may have looked like realism. Who understands banking better than bankers? Who has the incentive to keep the system stable better than those whose fortunes depend on it? They saw politics as a problem, not the solution. Legislatures were slow. Elections were noisy. Panic did not wait. But to anyone outside that circle, it looked like confession. It sounded like the country was being asked to sign over its emergency powers to the same people whose mistakes made emergencies inevitable. So the public reaction was not just skepticism. It was identity. It was cultural memory. The idea of being ruled by financial machinery, run from a city that most Americans would never visit, struck a nerve that didn't need evidence to vibrate. And in that sense, the Aldrich Plan was doomed the moment it had a name attached to it, because the name itself carried a map of alliances, a senator linked to high finance, a proposal linked to a secret meeting, a blueprint linked to the men the newspapers already suspected were pulling strings. The more technically defensible the plan was, the more politically toxic it became. The plan landed in a country that was already in the middle of a moral argument about money. Trust busting wasn't just about breaking companies. It was about breaking the feeling of being managed by forces you couldn't vote out. Railroads, steel, oil, banking. The word trust wasn't an economic category in the public mind. It was a psychological one. So the Aldrich Plan didn't just present a solution. It presented a fear with footnotes. Opponents didn't have to understand every mechanism. They only had to ask a question that sounded obvious. If this is a national necessity, why was it drafted like a private deal? If this is for the public good, why does it keep power close to the same small circle? If this is meant to stabilize everyone, why does it begin by stabilizing the people who already control credit? Those questions didn't need final answers. They needed airtime. And yet, the panic problem didn't vanish because a plan got mocked. The country still had the same brittle structure. Banks still failed in clusters. Credit still dried up at the worst moment. Farmers still suffered when currency tightened. Businesses still collapsed when confidence became currency. So politicians faced the same dilemma. The bankers did. The country needed a central mechanism. The country hated the idea of a central mechanism. That's where the real story starts. Not in the secret meeting, not in the draft, but in the redesign of legitimacy. Because once the Aldrich Plan was exposed as a banker's blueprint, the challenge wasn't to defeat it. The challenge was to make it passable, to keep the function and change the optics, to take a private draft and reframe it as public architecture. And this is where people often oversimplify. They frame it as the people versus the bankers, the good reformers versus the bad financiers, the bright line between public and private. But the line wasn't bright. It was negotiated. It was shaded. It was traded. A central reserve system was going to exist in some form because the alternative was chronic collapse. The fight was about who would own the story and who would hold the steering wheel when the next panic arrived. So the pressure shifted from pure design to political theater. Not cheap theater, not fake. Theater in the sense that legitimacy is always performed. The question wasn't just, can this institution prevent panics? The question was, can this institution survive its first crisis without being seen as a coup? Reformers needed a plan that could be sold as a break from Wall Street while still being acceptable to the banks that would have to use it. They needed to promise decentralization while still building a coordinated network. They needed to claim public control while ensuring the system wouldn't become a partisan printing press. Every word mattered. Every title mattered. Every appointment mechanism mattered. So did geography. So the idea of multiple reserve centers became a political tool. Not necessarily because it was the most elegant solution, but because it diffused fear. A system with regional nodes sounded less like a throne. It sounded like a map. It sounded American. That was the pivot. Take the central concept and scatter it just enough to make it defensible. Give it public face. Build in checks that look democratic, even if the daily operations would still lean on private expertise. Wrap the mechanism in language of service, stability, and public duty. And once you see that, you start noticing how often American institutions are built this way. The country resists concentration. So concentration arrives disguised as coordination. The Aldrich Plan had given away too much truth too early. It acknowledged what the system already was. A network dominated by the strongest banks, centered in the largest city, responsive to needs of credit markets. It wasn't wrong. It was just unsellable. So the replacement didn't have to be entirely different. It only had to feel different. This is the part people rarely sit with. The plan's failure was not the end of the idea. It was the prototype stage. It revealed which features trigger revolt and which features could be kept. It was a stress test of public tolerance. When the later system was constructed, it preserved the core function, a flexible currency and a lender of last resort. It preserved the idea of reserves pooled into a structure with authority. It preserved the need for coordination during crisis. It preserved the reliance on the banking system as the transmission mechanism, but it adjusted the narrative levers. It added public appointments. It scattered power across districts. It placed key authority in a board that could be described as independent. It made the institution harder to picture as a private club, even if private finance still had deep input. In other words, the Aldrich Plan didn't fail because its diagnosis was wrong. It failed because it didn't pass the legitimacy test. And legitimacy, in a country like the United States, is not a technical metric. It's an emotional one. It's tied to older fights, older fears, older words. So the real twist is not that the plan was rejected. The twist is that its rejection taught its designers and its opponents how to build the next version together. That word, together, feels uncomfortable, but it's closer to the truth than the clean morality tale. Reform doesn't always mean replacing a system's logic. Sometimes it means renegotiating who gets to claim it. The bankers weren't all powerful. If they were, the Aldrich Plan would have passed as written. The reformers weren't pure idealists. If they were, no central reserve mechanism would have survived the political storm. What happened instead was a compromise that preserved stability while reshaping accountability. And when you look at the machinery that emerged, you can feel the fingerprints of that original draft, not in identical wording, but in the architecture of assumptions. Assumptions like panics are not just bad luck, they are systemic. Liquidity must be created quickly, even if that feels unnatural. A crisis is not the time to debate morality. It's the time to keep the pipes from freezing. Private banks will always be part of the solution because they are the channels through which credit flows. Public oversight must exist because otherwise legitimacy collapses. And legitimacy matters because without it, the institution becomes a target in every downturn. Those assumptions are not partisan. They're structural. And once they become structural, they outlive the people who argued about them. So if you're asking how the Aldrich Plan still won, it's not because a cabal forced it through the back door. It's because the country needed something like it, and because the arguments it raised didn't disappear when the draft got buried. It also won in another way, quieter than policy. It changed the language of what was possible. Before those fights, the idea of a permanent institution that could expand and contract the money supply was still controversial at the level of basic identity. After the fight, the question shifted. Not should this exist, but how should it be governed? That shift is power. Because once the debate moves from existence to management, you've already conceded the main point. The institution is now part of the landscape. You can argue about its shape, but the fact of it becomes normal. That's a kind of victory that doesn't need a headline. And notice how that pattern repeats. A proposal arrives too blunt, too exposed, too honest about who benefits. It gets rejected. The public celebrates. Then later, a more sophisticated version arrives. It carries some reforms, some real changes, but it keeps the engine. It passes. And because it's less offensive, it becomes harder to oppose. People remember the rejection, not the redesign. They remember the scandal, not the successor. So what should you make of the secret meeting, the draft, the outrage? Maybe it's not a story about conspiracy. Maybe it's a story about how modern systems are born. They're not born clean. They're born through fear, through negotiation, through the collision between function and legitimacy. If you build a machine strong enough to stop a panic, you also build a machine strong enough to steer an economy. And steering an economy means steering lives. Wages, jobs, rents, home prices, the survival of small banks, the expansion of big ones, the winners in a downturn, the speed of recovery. So the question isn't whether the Aldrich Plan would have stabilized the system. The question is who would have been stabilized first. That's the subtext that made it impossible. Americans could accept stability, but not at the price of openly surrendering to the same networks they already mistrusted. They wanted protection without submission, and that demand created the shape of the institution that followed. A system designed to do something central while looking dispersed. A system designed to act quickly while being insulated from elections. A system designed to feel public while leaning on private channels. A system designed to be independent while still being accountable, at least in theory. Those are contradictions. They didn't get resolved. They got institutionalized. That might be the most American part of the story. Not the victory, not the failure, but the permanent compromise. The decision to live inside a tension rather than pick a side. If you zoom out, the Aldrich Plan becomes less like a scandal and more like a draft of the country's relationship with money in the modern era. Money as a public good, but also as a private weapon. Credit as a national bloodstream, but also as a market product. Stability as a promise, but also as leverage. And the money trust, fear wasn't rational. Concentrated finance does concentrate power, even if the people involved are competent. Even if their motives are mixed, the structure still tilts. It still hears some alarms faster than others. It still rescues some institutions sooner than others. It still speaks a language that not everyone understands, which means not everyone can challenge it. That's why the legitimacy issue never truly ends. It just goes quiet between crises. Every time the central system acts in an emergency, the old questions resurface. Who decided? Who benefited? Who paid later? What was prevented? And what was merely postponed? Was this about the public or about preserving a particular kind of financial order? Those questions don't require you to believe in villains. They only require you to accept that institutions protect the world they know how to measure. And what they know how to measure is the stability of credit markets, the solvency of large counterparties, the smoothness of settlement systems. Those are real. They matter. But they are not the same thing as human stability. Not always. So when someone says the Aldrich Plan failed, you can agree. Technically, it didn't pass. It didn't become law as written. It became a symbol of arrogance, a lesson in political miscalculation. But if you look at the world that emerged after, you might ask a colder question. What does it mean for a plan to fail? If its core logic becomes inevitable, what does it mean for the public to win if the machinery still arrives, just with better packaging? And maybe the deeper question is this. If legitimacy is the only thing that separates public power from private power, then what happens when legitimacy is engineered, not faked engineered? When the structure is designed not just to work, but to be tolerated? At that point, is the country rejecting control or only rejecting the feeling of being controlled? The Aldrich Plan was too direct to survive. It asked the country to trust a class it didn't trust, and to do it openly. That was never going to happen. So the country got something else. A system that could be described as public and decentralized. A system that could claim independence. A system with a complicated architecture that made it hard to point at a single villain, hard to point at a single hero. And that complexity is not an accident. Complexity is protection. It's a way to keep an institution functional under constant suspicion, which is understandable and also revealing, because suspicion isn't a bug in American political life. It's a feature. It's the pressure that shapes the machine. It forces redesign. It forces masks. It forces compromises that satisfy nobody fully, which is why they survive. So when you hear the phrase "a draft that failed," don't picture a dead document in an archive. Picture a rehearsal. A first attempt to solve a problem that would not let the country go. And then look around at what exists now. Not the names, not the headlines, not the slogans. The function. When the next shock hits, who has the authority to flood the system with liquidity? Who decides which institutions are systemically important? Who draws the line between rescue and reward? Who can act in days while the public argues in months? That's the lever the Aldrich Plan wanted to formalize. That's the lever the country said no to. That's the lever the country eventually accepted, because it couldn't accept the alternative. And if that's true, then the Aldrich Plan didn't lose. It evolved. So the uneasy question at the end isn't whether the plan was good or bad. That's too simple, and it's not the point. The question is whether Americans ever defeated the thing they were afraid of, or whether they simply demanded it speak in a different voice. Because if the same power can return again and again, as long as it learns how to be palatable, then the real contest isn't over policy. It's over perception. And that's a fight no draft ever truly loses.